Welcome to the OR Today webinar series. We're excited to have nearly 100 registered attendees for today's webinar. The third annual OR Today Live Surgical Conference will be held August 27th through the 29th at the Hyatt Regency Reston, just outside of Washington, D.C. Details are available online at ortodaylive.com. We will award one OR Today Live tote bag to the first attendee who can tell me who the first president to live in the White House was. Use the questions feature on your webinar dashboard to answer now. While you are answering, I want to remind you that today's webinar is eligible for one continuing education credit. To obtain your certificate, you must complete the post-webinar survey, which will appear immediately on your computer screen at the end of today's call. If you do not receive the survey, please email us at webinar@mdpublishing.com. All right, and the winner of today's prize, the OR Today Live tote bag, is looks like we have Renee Kuda. Congratulations, Renee. The correct answer is John Adams. Our presenter today is Daniel Vukelich, President and CEO of the Association of Medical Device Reprocessors. Dan, you may begin whenever you are ready.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me today. I guess no tote bag for me. I would have guessed Thomas Jefferson. So I don't know my history, even though I live in D.C. Well, I appreciate everyone participating here today. Again, as introduced, my name is Dan Vukelich. I'm the President and CEO of the Association of Medical Device Reprocessors, AMDR. So I thought we could talk about single-use device reprocessing here today. In order to ensure the continuing education credits, we're going to use the full hour. That said, I think I'll present for 40 to 45 minutes here today. But as with many presentations, I think a lot of the most helpful information comes out of the Q&A session. So please, during the course of the presentation, if you'll feel free to mark down or write down what questions or subjects you want to bring up, I think that will be helpful for everyone, and certainly for myself, to understand the current challenges that hospitals are facing with regard to their SUD or single-use device reprocessing programs. So just taking a step backwards to introduce the issue, I mean, think of how far we've come. This idea of reusing single-use devices. I mean, it's contrary to common sense, and yet now we have a regulated commercial industry that meets FDA standards that's saving U.S. and Canadian hospitals almost $500 million a year. So that tells you how expensive and how much money U.S. hospitals are spending on these disposable or single-use devices. If these companies can come around and still make a profit, albeit less, in putting new life into products and extending their lifespan. So what we know now is after 17 years of regulation, meaning FDA began regulating the reprocessing of single-use devices as a manufacturing activity in 2000, most U.S. hospitals now do reprocess with an FDA-regulated vendor. It has been a proven strategy with now 20 years of data to help hospitals reduce their supply chain costs. Practice Greenhealth in particular has noted the dramatic effect that SUD reprocessing programs have on allowing hospitals to reduce medical waste, particularly in the OR. In fact, AMDR members divert tens of millions of pounds of waste annually. But in terms of the agenda here today, I thought it would be helpful first if I spent a few minutes and a few slides giving an overview of AMDR and my membership in the commercial SUD reprocessing industry. And then it all boils down to three main things: safety, savings, and environmentalism. Obviously, nobody would use any device unless they were sure it was safe. And yet, oftentimes, as I'm sure you will tell me, we will have physician resistance or those who question whether or not indeed it is safe to reuse a single-use device. And so I'll briefly talk about that. Savings is fundamentally the reason that hospitals would choose to reprocess a single-use device, to save money. There's only so much resources. And an increasingly important benefit or reason hospitals have been reprocessing are for the sustainability or environmental benefits. There is a mountain of trash that each hospital generates each day, and so it doesn't do us any good to make people better and less sick in our health institutions only to create an environmental disaster later, which makes people sicker. So if we can do the responsible thing environmentally and reduce the amount of devices a hospital has to use, reduce the amount that they have to throw away, that's also a very compelling benefit for many hospitals. The last chunk of slides that I've prepared here today have to do with current challenges and competitive threats that sometimes undermine reprocessing programs. And I guess after now 17 years of FDA regulation, 20 years of this industry being around, and 20 years of AMDR, I take it as a compliment that reprocessing is growing, it is legitimized, it is a best practice adopted by most hospitals. And so those manufacturers that continue to resist reprocessing are taking it to a new level, meaning their resistant efforts or their tactics to try to thwart reprocessing have taken new turns. And so I want to talk about that today. I'd also like to get input through the Q&A session from you on what the primary challenges are, but I've outlined what it is my members are reporting to me. First are contracting pitfalls, meaning original manufacturers who want to sell you more devices and see that you reprocess less devices are putting crafty new terms into some of their contracts. And so I thought we could discuss some of those. Of course, I'm always told that there's always physician resistance, and so we should bone up on those arguments that will address safety, savings, and sustainability in a way that it will combat or with facts and evidence tell doctors what they need to hear. Vendor interference, meaning sales rep vendors who may be interfering in the way you operate your hospital, including your reprocessing program. Of course, we see forced obsolescence, and this has been something that manufacturers do across many industries, including the device industry, by putting chips, for instance, in handles of electronic medical devices. Can they get them to be turned off, or in a sense, enforce the obsolescence of that product? Not for a patient safety perspective, but to make sure that you have to buy a new device. And then lastly, I thought I could leave some tips and some best practices based on what I've learned on hospitals are going through in these regards. So I see the objectives today as first, understanding FDA regulation of SUD reprocessing. I sort of call this back to basics. I do this every day. I'm quite familiar with the laws and the regulations that apply to single-use device manufacturing, but not everybody does this every day. So if I can provide a recap in a way that assists you in having the facts to support your program, then I think that's a good objective to have. I think understanding the drivers behind industry growth, and this is largely focused on the savings and sustainability elements. Identify and analyze these contracting language proposals that often thwart reprocessing programs and therefore limit your savings potential. And then lastly, I hope to identify some tools and best practices that can help you at least be aware of sort of pitfalls that can allow your reprocessing program to become derailed. But first, as I said, just an introduction to AMDR. So I've been with these reprocessors now for 17 years. I joined in 2000, which was the same year that FDA began to regulate the practice of SUD reprocessing. And AMDR was formed 3 years prior to that. So 20 years AMDR has been around. So you see we have a new logo here. But in short, AMDR is based in DC. It's now international in its focus. But we're a nonprofit and we're vendor neutral. And we advance the interests, both legally and regulatorily, and other trade interests of the commercial single-use device or SUD reprocessing industry. AMDR members now serve a majority of U.S. hospitals, including all of the honor roll hospitals as listed by U.S. News and World Report. And our European member serves a majority of German academic medical centers and about 1,000 other European hospitals. On the next slide, I've listed here AMDR's membership. AMDR has 5 companies within its membership. The vast majority of commercial SUD reprocessing is conducted by these 5 firms. There's a few bullets here on each, but each is fully committed fundamentally to the mission that AMDR has, which also includes the concept of maximizing your reprocessing savings and sustainability benefits. And so that's sort of what we're talking about in the slides here today. So just to give a very brief history on how far we've come, as I mentioned now several times, we've been regulated as a manufacturing activity since 2000 by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. In Germany, this has been regulated since 2002 under what they call the CRINCO requirements. In 2000, the year I joined, we saved U.S. hospitals $20 million. Today, AMDR members save U.S. hospitals about $500 million. We serve every major hospital system in the U.S. and all of the top hospitals, as I said, listed by U.S. News and World Report, and 95% of German academic medical centers. But no conversation about the reuse of single-use devices is appropriate unless it's put into context. And I think these are things you all know, but often I think as part of the back to basics discussion, we have to talk about why devices are labeled for single use to begin with. First, the original manufacturer chooses how to label the devices they're going to sell. No regulatory authority of which I'm aware, including the US FDA, makes the decision for the manufacturer on how a device should be labeled. What we did see in the early days of AMDR were that some devices had their labels switched by the original manufacturer. And this largely took place in the late 1980s. There was the development of new plastics, or at least a lot more applicability of plastics in the medical device industry. But this was also the era of HIV. And so hospitals were looking for disposable versions of devices that used to be reusable, both because they could not be made cheaper and out of fears that we didn't yet know how to kill the HIV virus. Well, that's all now history, and we obviously know how to address that. But what we have seen, though, is even though the manufacturer switched the labels on many devices from reusable to single-use, they haven't switched those labels back. We have seen some devices sold as reusable in Europe that are sold as single-use here. We also have seen single-use devices sold with cleaning instructions. And as I think you all know, some major original equipment manufacturers, including some of my members, have SUD reprocessing programs. So the line between single-use and reusable isn't as black and white as some may think. I don't think it's gray either. But the reality is a number of things have contributed to the sense over the years that single use does not always mean single use. And I don't think there's much sense in arguing about it other than to know that the FDA's perspective is if you reuse a single-use device, you're a manufacturer. And that way, regulatorily speaking, all devices, whether labeled by the original manufacturer as for single use or as labeled by the manufacturer as reusable, will come to market meeting the same safety standards, meaning an SUD reprocessor has to prove that a single-use device that's reprocessed is as safe and effective as its original single-use OEM product. Ultimately, just to conclude on the single-use label, and because I don't want you to take my word for it, in 2008, a second Government Accountability Office, or USGAO report, concluded that the decision to label a device as single-use or reusable rests with the manufacturer. Thus, the device may be labeled as single-use because the manufacturer chooses not to conduct the studies needed to demonstrate that the device can be labeled as reusable. And that makes sense. If you decide to market your device as single-use, FDA only expects the manufacturer to provide enough data showing it's safe and effective to last once. If a device manufacturer, on the other hand, wants to label a device as reusable, FDA's expectation will be that that manufacturer submits the cleaning instructions that have been validated to prove that that device will be clean and sterile and it will be functional after repeated use and therefore remain safe. And so just economically, in addition to regulatorily speaking, it's far more efficient come to market if you just slap single use on the device versus reusable. And that's the situation we're in. But the reality is we can't be that wasteful. If there are a subset of single-use devices that can be reprocessed, then why not? We all have to do more with less. AMDR estimates that just 2 to 3% of all devices currently labeled as for single use are eligible for reprocessing. And that means that by adhering to our safety principles to be eligible, we must do a cleaning, sterility, and performance validation for that device to prove scientifically that that reprocessed device will function and be as clean and as sterile as its predicate or the original device. In addition to that, AMDR members also test or inspect 100% of their devices. This is not a regulatory requirement, and it's not something I don't think any other subset of the medical device manufacturing industry does. But we're held to a higher standard, and hospitals expect that we will give individual scrutiny to all of our devices. So devices such as a compression sleeve or a tourniquet cuff, which are fairly simple, will be checked to make sure they can maintain pressure. Electrosurgical devices are hooked up to the generator to ensure that the electroconnectivity still works. Cardiac catheters are checked to make sure each of the electrodes on the distal end work. And so all devices are actually functionally tested. For those that cannot be tested, such as a saw blade or scissors, it will be visually inspected. So every device is individually tested or inspected, and that gives hospitals peace of mind. Unlike original manufacturers of either reusable or single-use devices, reprocessors of single-use devices are also committed to 100% device traceability. After all, the FDA requires that we track how many times the device has been reprocessed so that we know how to reject it and when to reject it when it's reached its maximum number of cycles. And so all devices are traced in some way. Sometimes it's with a sticker with a barcode on it. Sometimes it's with laser etching or ink pad printing. Sometimes it's just a marker, something to indicate to us that we have reprocessed it and that we know the number of turns it has had through the reprocessing cycle. And then finally, fundamentally, AMDR's members are committed to the premise that we can only reprocess those devices where we have the data to show that it's safe. And that means having that cleaning biocompatibility, sterilization, and functional testing data. I think you probably have a good idea of what it is that the commercial reprocessors have clearance or approval from FDA to market, but just to give some examples, in terms of dollar savings, the cardiac catheterization lab tends to be the area where a hospital can achieve the greatest amount of financial and waste reduction benefits. EP and diagnostic catheters can be very expensive, hundreds to thousands of dollars. And if 2 to 3 EP catheters are used per procedure, and they're $1,000 each, if we can reprocess them 2 to 3 times, that's significant savings to the hospital, meaning the hospital can then repurpose those funds into buying new equipment or hiring new staff or keeping staff on, rather than sending that money out the door to a medical device manufacturer. But in the cardiovascular heading, by volume, sequential compression sleeves, tourniquet cuffs, pulse oximeter sensors, these are all devices that, while far less costly, we reprocess mountains of. By volume, I think the tourniquet cuffs and pulse oximeter sensors are our number 1 and 2 products. Some AMDR members do non-invasive devices, low risk, typically class 1 devices, bed alarms, blood pressure cuffs, transfer mattresses. And a growing area is in the laparoscopic surgery area. As you all probably know, these devices are getting more and more complex. They're often electrosurgical, and they're not meant to be disassembled and cleaned. They're quite complex, and so a hospital wouldn't be able to do it. And so reprocessors are upping the ante and making investments in their R&D to find ways to take these products apart, clean them, repair them, and turn them around. And again, these products can be very expensive, hundreds of dollars a piece sometimes for electrosurgical instruments. All right, the next 3 headings are safety and, or next 2 are safety then and environmentalism. I've sort of tried to summarize the 20 years of data that we have to support the safety argument. The effect of FDA's regulation of reprocessing in the U.S. beginning in 2000 was basically to stop hospitals from reprocessing in-house. And after all, FDA didn't want hospitals reusing single-use devices because these poor hospitals had not been given cleaning instructions for these single-use devices. And so it puts them in the untenable position of feeling that in order to save money, they have to illicitly reuse single-use devices. And so that wasn't fair to staff, and it wasn't fair to patients. And so now the situation is that nearly all commercial SUD reprocessing has moved to FDA-regulated commercial firms. We now have 20 years of adverse event data, and there are very few adverse events associated with reprocessed SUDs. And those adverse events that are in FDA's database do tend to match or mirror the same problems that the same devices, when new, experience when there are failure points. Reprocessors aren't perfect. We have failures. We have recalls. We're like any other manufacturer. But there is no data showing anything specific to the reprocessing in FDA's database that's contributing to these adverse events. AMDR has a section on its website, which I would encourage you to see if you're interested in the 20 years of peer-reviewed literature that has been released supporting the safety. We have decades now of peer-reviewed literature and clinical experience and a majority of support from the clinical community, meaning most U.S. hospitals. The 2008 GAO report I mentioned earlier also concluded, when looking at the adverse event data, that we found no reason to question FDA's analysis indicating no causative link has been established between reported injuries or deaths and reprocessed SUDs. That's a remarkable statement and a real bolstering of the safety record of the SUD reprocessing industry. This, and I won't read it to you, but in short, lists the requirements that apply to SUD reprocessors. Excuse me, that's the next slide. But basically, in short, in the U.S., SUD reprocessing is legal and regulated. It is held to the same standards as any other manufacturer. In fact, reprocessors have to meet all the standards of any other medical device manufacturer, plus provide additional validation data and labeling requirements. And sometimes, as even the FDA acknowledged, that the data requirements that reprocessors are subject exceed the requirements for even the original equipment manufacturers. And these are the basic 7 buckets of medical device requirements that apply to any manufacturer, including reprocessors. The additional data that reprocessors must submit is under the heading of pre-market approval or clearance. Ordinarily, manufacturers do not provide cleaning validations or sterilization validation data on a pre-market basis. Ordinarily, FDA will come and check your manufacturing facility after you've come to market to make sure those are up to snuff. In our case, we submit it on a pre-market basis, meaning the agency can look at our cleaning data both before we come to market and after. These are some of the journals that have highlighted the scientific literature, or the scientific literature supporting or including articles supporting of reprocessing, and these are some of the clinical institutions that have released position statements supportive of the FDA's requirements of SUD reprocessors and the safety record of the industry. As I mentioned, I'm very proud of the fact that all of the country's honor roll hospitals report reprocessing with an AMDR member. And so these are those institutions. The very best institutions in America are doing this. And because it saves money. So I'll address in the next 2 sections the financial and the sustainability elements, and then we'll move into the tips on protecting your program or how to maximize it. So obviously hospitals reprocess to save money. Why? Because on average a reprocessed device costs half as much as buying a new device. That 50% cost covers all of the operations of the third-party reprocessor. All of the R&D, all of the logistics, all of the FDA compliance are covered in that cost. Typical hospitals can save between $500,000 and $2 million per year if they fully maximize their reprocessing program. But it's not just the immediate 50% savings. Red bag waste or hazardous medical waste is very expensive to dispose of. And if by reprocessing devices we can help hospitals reduce the amount of red bag waste, we're not just reducing the amount of waste, but we're reducing the amount of money hospitals have to spend to get rid of that waste. The third element that a lot of people don't naturally realize is the competitive benefit. So yes, reprocessed devices on average are 50% less, and yes, they can help reduce the amount of waste and red bag waste disposal costs. But what we see is that original manufacturers lower their prices for new devices if a hospital is reprocessing single-use devices. But for the competition that SUD reprocessors bring to the market, many manufacturers would have had no incentive to lower their price. And so hospitals that reprocess force their OEM vendors to lower their prices in order to compete. And for me, this is very similar to the early days of the generic drug industry. The brand name drug industry had no incentive to reduce costs because people had to pay whatever they were billing until the advent of the generic drug industry. And so I think there's a lot of parallels on a smaller scale that reprocessors are going through. And lastly, I think it's the morally right thing to do. We are all asked to do more with less. There's only so much money. There's only so much waste we can contribute. There are only so many dollars coming into the hospital and only so many patients that we can serve with those dollars. It is both fiscally and environmentally responsible to do the most you can with what you have. And if you have a bunch of trocars or harmonic scalpels or electrophysiology catheters that would otherwise go into the garbage, that can be repurposed to extend their lifespan, to extend the amount of services that your hospital can offer, or extend your resources to keep your own staff or make your own medical device choices, that I think is a morally preferable choice. It helps keep the money in your institution rather than sending it to medical device companies. And the data supports this. The Commonwealth Fund, in conjunction with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, did a study on environmentalism in healthcare, and they included SUD reprocessing as one of the measures. They estimate, extrapolating data from a common procedure, that the savings that could be achievable to sustainable interventions could be $5.5 billion over 5 years, or $15 billion over 10 years. And for the reprocessing specific portion of that, they believe that we could save $540 million annually, or about $2.7 billion over 5 years. Well, we're already doing about that, and this is based on just one procedure. So the data here supports the fact that the U.S. healthcare system can save a tremendous amount of money. And this has been reported repeatedly in many of the trade press journals, a list of which we also keep on the AMDR website. If you're looking for other case studies or examples of articles highlighting how other hospitals are saving money and reducing waste. Lastly, on the subjects of the benefits of environmentalism, Practice Greenhealth has identified SUD reprocessing as one of the single most impactful sustainability initiatives that hospitals can undertake. The American Nursing Association, AORN, Practice Greenhealth, and Healthcare Without Harm have all recognized or endorsed reprocessing as a way to reduce waste. And even if the crunchy granola green environmentalism arguments don't interest you, you may be throwing titanium, gold, platinum, steel, and other valuable plastics in the garbage by not reprocessing. These products can be taken out and repurposed, even if they're not reprocessed. All right. On average, a hospital can reduce medical waste through reprocessing by 50,000 pounds, or about 5 elephants. And as I said, that includes a lot of titanium, gold, platinum, and steel. I think one of the most credible sources on this is Practice Greenhealth. Here I believe we have 2016 or 15 data highlighting what its participating hospitals are reporting on the reprocessing front. Practice Greenhealth reports on many fronts, but on this, there are 322 hospitals. They report that 97% are collecting devices in the OR, and 85% of the hospitals are purchasing them back, meaning some hospitals are donor hospitals. They're sending in spent SUDs and not necessarily buying them back. Obviously, the real savings is in buying it back, so I encourage you to both collect the devices with a reprocessor and buy them back. But the average institution that participated in Practice Greenhealth's data generation efforts saved $295,000, and its net savings was $30 million for those 322 hospitals. All right, and now to address the competitive threats. As I said in the beginning, I take it as a compliment that reprocessing is growing and important now that manufacturers are coming up with new unique ways to try to stop hospitals from reprocessing. The first are what we see as OEM, or original equipment manufacturer contracting practices. And I'll discuss it in another slide, but these include bundling and minimum purchase requirements, which have the effect of minimizing the benefits you get from reprocessing, or minimizing your savings and sustainability benefits. Of course, let's talk about continued physician resistance, vendor interference, and by that I mean sales reps, and then forced obsolescence. The reason I bring this up is AMDR and its members meet from time to time, and an issue that kept coming up on AMDR agendas were these threats to reprocessing that we're seeing from original manufacturers. And so we addressed it in a summit, and we met in February in Phoenix a year or two ago, And we sat down, and I asked the members to identify for me what it is their hospital partners are reporting back to the reprocessors are the major things that are disrupting their programs or preventing hospitals from truly maximizing on the savings and sustainability benefits. And basically, it all boiled down to what they called OEM interference. The first bucket that they highlighted was new contracting tactics. The second is continued sales rep interference. And the third is continued physician resistance. And so with those marching orders, we addressed the issues at AMDR. That said, before I go any further, I am a lawyer, but I cannot give any of you legal advice. Your hospital has to decide for yourself what it is that is right for you. So my only advice is when presented with new contract language from original manufacturers, which seems to be trying to compete with reprocessors, is to go to your own risk management department or counsel's office to alert them to changes. And you must exercise your own independent business judgment on what prices are best for you, which suppliers are best to work with. And so take what I'm offering with a grain of salt. If it's helpful, great. If it's not, that's fine too. But the major takeaway from our perspective is by using less reprocessed SUDs, hospitals also then voluntarily reduce the number of competitive device firms seeking their business. That decreases competition, which results in increased costs over time. As I said in the example earlier on, like generic drugs, if medical device manufacturers have no competition, they have no incentive to lower your prices. So in terms of the anti-reprocessing contracting tactics, these are the 5 examples that my members have reported to me. I'd be interested during the Q&A portion if anyone else has a different spin or take on these or could affirm that indeed they've seen these types of situations. But what we see is once a hospital enters into an agreement with a commercial reprocessor, the original manufacturer for devices will employ one of several tactics or may employ one of several tactics. The first we see, or most common, I think, is free capital equipment in exchange for an exclusive agreement to provide disposables. The area where we've seen this is pumps and sleeves. Hospitals go through a tremendous amount of compression sleeves, and so the economic benefit of getting free pumps looks pretty good. I don't know, without looking at what the individual contractor proposal is going to be in the best interest of your hospital. But my guess is, having looked at several examples of these, is in the long run, the manufacturer wins out. If they get you to buy these, to sign agreements where they give you free pumps, because what we have seen buried in the language sometimes are minimum purchase orders or penalties if you don't reach a minimum purchase order for the consumable portion or the sleeves. And they bury that in there because they want it to look good at the outset, and it requires vigilance on the hospital's part to see that it may not be as good as it says it is. If you end up having to buy more compression sleeves than you're actually using, it doesn't do you any benefit then in the long run economically to get those free pumps. The second thing we see is unusually low prices on single-use devices that match or beat reprocessed devices. And admittedly, this is very hard for reprocessors to compete with. I'll give a historical example on this. Biopsy forceps were a device that we started reprocessing in the late 1990s. We don't do much of them anymore. We reverse engineered biopsy forceps from a major original manufacturer. They sold both a reusable version and a disposable version. When we reverse engineered them, we found out they're the same. The same product is just being sold under 2 different labels because some hospitals will want to spend more money and buy a reusable version, which they would then reuse pursuant to the instructions. And some hospitals would spend less money and buy the single-use version. I think the single-use version was being sold for around $60. So I would imagine the reusable one was much more, maybe $120. So in the early 2000s, we were reprocessing these $60 biopsy forceps labeled for single-use and selling them back to hospitals for $24. Very quickly, in the early 2000s, once we became more competitive with hospitals and selling more of these devices, the original manufacturer went into many of our hospital customers nationwide and said, if you promise to stop reprocessing those biopsy forceps and buy only new single-use biopsy forceps from us, we'll sell them to you for $12. So $60 biopsy forceps went down to $12. Reprocessors can't reprocess a biopsy forceps for $12. So we got pushed out of that market. largely. But where would the price be today had there not been competition presented by the third-party reprocessors? So we see examples like this, and I would simply urge the hospital to be mindful that, yeah, you may be getting a good deal. Find out if there is indeed a minimum purchase agreement. And after all, are these vendors you want to deal with that have been charging you $60 all along for a product that they can still make a profit on at 12? The third example of what we're seeing, and admittedly not a lot of, but I warn you to be cautious of it, is now we see original manufacturers trying new contract language, and this would typically come when they roll out a new version of a product, so the newest trocar, I would guess, or the newest harmonic scalpel. And we've seen an attempt, instead of selling you trocars, they're going to license them to you, and that license restricts them to a single use. This is pretty scary stuff. You're not buying software, you're buying devices. And so I wonder if the price point is going to change. Are they going to suddenly charge you a lot less for that license to reuse the product? Are they going to come back and pick up those spent devices so it's not your burden then to dispose of them? This isn't tremendously popular, but we have seen attempts at this. And ultimately, I would say, evaluate these and ask those questions. But the way we typically buy things in the hospitals is once you buy those trocars, they're yours, and they're yours to do with what you see fit. And so before surrendering any rights to reuse those, I would do an analysis on whether or not that's really worth it. The last two bullets are newer, and we have seen this since some of the original manufacturers have bought third-party reprocessors. Now, if you're both the OEM and a reprocessor, you can offer a blend, where you can sell the hospital both a 6-pack of trocars that's half new and half reprocessed. So that sounds great. That may be in the best interest of your institution because it may be the best of both worlds. But it requires an analysis to make sure that indeed that blend is going to result in a savings point for you that is comparable to if you just reprocessed everything you could. The manufacturer may try to put more new devices in that blend, or may not be transparent to you on what the blend is, and may require you to purchase minimums. And so you've got to read the fine details to make sure that if you do decide to do a blend, that you're not going to be on the hook for buying more devices than you really will need or want, or that you're not going to get, or that you will be given transparency from your supplier that they are indeed reprocessing the devices you send back, and they are indeed sending them back. I know that was dense legal stuff. I apologize. So moving on, there is a case study that I would urge you to check out that talked about some of the latter examples where manufacturers offered a blend and where a hospital had dealt with a reprocessor only. And so in this example here in EP Lab Digest, 2 EP labs in North Carolina, both evaluated programs from different vendors. One was a blend, one was strictly a reprocessor. And the results were in this example that if you managed your program and you worked both with the OEM and the reprocessor, meaning you didn't buy into these blends, you were able to save considerable, much more money. They said in their summary that it requires strong C-suite engagement to maintain your reprocessing program and a strong vendor partner, meaning a strong reprocessing partner. The author's lessons learned are to educate and drive engagement. Everybody's got to know what you're up to with your reprocessing program. To maximize utilization, which is part of what AMDR's mantra is. In order to get the benefits, you have to maximize use of those reprocessed devices first. You also have to optimize collections, put every device in the bin possible, and you have to evaluate the pros and cons of working with multiple vendors. And the savings could vary. If you don't maximize, meaning if the wheels come off the bus in any way, meaning you have poor collections, you'll have significantly lower yields in your reprocessing savings. If you have a high reject rate, meaning devices are not treated well or they're bent, then you're going to save less as well. Or you don't buy back what you're putting in the bin. You can considerably reduce your savings. So this is a calculator that my members have put together, and I think these slides will be available to all. But these 3 main variables are crucial in order to maximize the savings potential. You have to collect all of the devices possible, you have to treat them with care, and you have to buy back and use the devices that you're reprocessing to inure the benefits. So in terms of best practices, when looking at contracts, I urge you, whenever new contracts are put before you to buy some new sweet deal on new devices, look carefully. Are there minimum purchase amounts or are there exclusivity requirements? They may or may not be in your best interest, and so I would just look for that because I suspect it's in there. If there are minimum purchase requirements, do a return on investment. Are you really going to buy that many trocars? If you contacted a reprocessor vendor and they could use a trocar 2 or 3 times, could you actually reduce the amount of trocars you need to buy? And there's a Practice Greenhealth cost of ownership calculator tool that they've made available to members if that's of interest in doing that. Seek support. You shouldn't have to fight these battles on your own. Everybody wants your business and everyone wants your attention. So contact your own contracting personnel and be on alert yourself and alert them to be on alert. Notify legal counsel if sudden sweet deals get offered. If they look good, investigate it. But sometimes legal can assist in the reviewing the contract to see if it's all really there. And notify your reprocessor. They may be able to come back and discuss or advise you on ways that they can help you to maximize the savings by buying a certain amount of new of a certain brand because it may be reprocessed or reprocessed more. In terms of pushback, this is becoming less of an issue, fortunately, but of course we always have that sales rep who only is making money if they get you to purchase so many devices. If you have a reprocessing policy, you can tell the sales reps your facility is committed to reprocessing. You're going to buy both new devices and reprocess devices, so he or she should be happy with what they're getting, but you also have a moral responsibility to use your resources efficiently. Further, and we've seen interference, and that should not be tolerated, and it will result in the sales rep losing privileges. On the extreme side, we have seen sales reps bend or break devices before they go into the bin to be reprocessed. Those aren't the sales rep's devices to bend or break. They're yours. They're the property of the hospital, and so that should not be tolerated. I would also consider, if you get a contract and it has minimum purchase agreements, just striking it out to see if the vendor will honor the agreement without the minimum purchase agreement. And fundamentally, as any lawyer would say, if you ever feel pressured, confused, or uncomfortable, just don't sign. One slide on physician resistance. Inside these slides, I would urge you to rely on any of the data, the peer-reviewed, the FDA data, the GAO study, as ways of addressing physician resistance. But one study in particular looked at failure rates for reprocessed devices and actually found that reprocessed devices failed less than new. So if your doctor's convinced that reprocessed devices are second good, there's a study out there showing just the opposite. And that may be because we test or inspect every device. As for competitor vendor pushback, we talked about this. The new example we're seeing is device reps or techs will say, well, if you're reprocessing, we're no longer going to support these cases. And we see it largely in the EP lab. I can't give you advice on what to do, but boy, is that pretty terrible treatment to you as a customer, that they're going to tell you that they're no longer going to support you. Is there another vendor that will gladly take your business? Why now are they threatening not to do business with you? Is it suddenly because their profits are being threatened? You hate to be confrontational with anyone because you have to do business with all of these people. But I think the vendor, open the door when they start to threaten not to support cases. The last thing is forced obsolescence. And this is something I would just be mindful you be aware of. Chips or other electronic devices put into medical devices to stop them from using don't benefit you in any way. And so I would ask your vendor what actual patient benefit there is to having a new version of a product with a chip in it. And frankly, not to buy it. To buy the old model if you can, especially if the old model is available as reprocessed. So that's it for me. I took a little bit longer, but I think we still have about 15 minutes for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dan. A reminder to everyone that you can submit your questions on your dashboard on the right-hand side of your screen. Feel free to go ahead and submit those now, and we'll get to as many as we can. We've had a few come in throughout the presentation here, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. The first one, we are being presented with bundled contracts whereby the vendor, which is both an OEM and a reprocessor, promises to give us the best of both worlds at a blended price. Is this ultimately a good deal?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I think that's one of the more common things we're seeing right now. as I said sort of repeatedly, I cannot give your hospital advice. But my guess is if you read the actual terms of the proposal of the blended arrangement, you'll find a minimum purchase requirement or a penalty if you don't purchase a certain amount of devices. And so look at your past spend or how many trocars you're using. But I would also encourage you to talk to your reprocessing vendor to see how many less trocars or whatever the product is, how many less you can use if you fully reprocess, and then do the math. So yes, a blend may be a good deal for you, but frankly, what my members are reporting is that the hospitals, like in the brand study in my slides, end up spending a lot more because ultimately it ends up being in that vendor's interest to put in more new devices than reprocessed devices.
Okay, thank you, Dan. The next question we have here, what are some devices in the OR that are commonly used in a reprocessing program?
So I would break it down, and I know I did it a little bit here in the slides, but I would break down commonly reprocessed devices into 4 buckets. And so let's start with the question with the OR. Electrosurgical devices and laparoscopic devices, so ultrasonic or harmonic scalpels, trocars, graspers, forceps, those types used in laparoscopic surgery, and that's a growing area. The second area is cardiology, and by that I mean the cardiac cath lab. The third area is in, I would say, what we call nursing or non-invasive, blood pressure cuffs, tourniquet cuffs, air mattresses, air transfer mattresses, and the like. And then the last area is orthopedics, and the orthopedics are blades, bits, burrs, typically metal devices that can be sharpened and repurposed for another few lives. So those are the sort of 4 buckets. A 5th bucket I'll mention that some reprocessors may do, but it's less important, is open but unused. For some time, AMDR members have simply been re-sterilizing and sending back open but unused devices. But I have to be frank, it's not something we can help hospitals with anymore. We still have to do a sterilization validation for those products, even though they're not going through the full reprocessing procedure. And that's very costly to make sure that we understand that there's nothing going to happen wrong adversely to that device if you throw it in the ETO sterilizer again. So some reprocessors may offer that, but it's not a huge part of our business. So those are the 4 main buckets.
Okay. We just had a question come in. How do you know if a reprocessor is an FDA-regulated vendor?
Sure. So the short answer is that's the law. So if they're not, that's they're in violation of the law if they're using single-use devices. But one can check. I can provide as a follow-up, but on FDA's database, they have what they call a registration and listing database. And so if you're interested in confirming not only whether or not a potential vendor or reprocessor or any medical device company, you can plug in their name, look them up, and when you get the results, it will not only show their registration, but it will list all the products that they market and all of the products that they have been cleared to market. So hospitals can do their due diligence to confirm if they have any suspicions that a vendor may not be quite right, that indeed they are registered and listed, meaning they are FDA regulated and operating lawfully.
Okay. The next one we have here, how can reprocessed devices be up to 50% less than new ones? Do they save money for the OR in more than one way?
Yes, indeed. And so I think a lot of people are amazed, especially those that have toured reprocessing facilities, when they see how detailed and how manufacturing-like our facilities look, and to say you're able to sell that same product that the OEM did, but for roughly half, and still make money. And so admittedly, as I said before, our margins are far slimmer. You know, we do not enjoy the same profit margin that an original manufacturer did. But the fact that we have found space to make a profit between the first and second life shows that OEM profits are quite high. So there's additional ways that the hospital will save, though, and this is sort of like compounding the benefits. When we talked about a device can be used, a device that's reused is half. But if you can reuse an EP catheter 3 or 4 times, that's 3 or 4 turns or 3 less devices you have to buy new. Then, of course, as we discussed, there's the savings associated with waste reduction, and then the competitive benefits, meaning original manufacturers will sometimes lower their prices with the reprocessor in order to compete, meaning the hospital gets a multiple-fold cost savings benefit beyond the initial 50% savings reduction.
Great. And I think we have time for one more question. This one came in. What can I do to help with greater clinician buy-in?
Yeah, and I know this is tough, and my hope is, over time it's going to be easier, from a doctor's perspective, and, some of them are more willing than others. There's the what's in it for me argument, and it doesn't help if the doctor seems to have a chummy relationship with that sales rep. And I'm speaking anecdotally here just because that's what I'm told. Ultimately, the hospital's paying the price for the devices, and so ultimately that should be the hospital's decisions, though I know you need to make your doctors happy. So engagement, having them understand the safety and the regulatory proven benefits of reprocessing, plus the savings and sustainability mean your hospital can do more by reprocessing. And so it requires constant vigilance on keeping your physicians engaged and understanding what you're doing. I think some of the data that I shared in the slides could be helpful if their concern is scientific or factual. An overwhelming majority of the independent clinical groups like AAOS or NASP or the American College of Cardiology have supported reprocessing, and so I would urge you to look at those and keep the pressure on, because obviously the money that you're throwing out the door to an original manufacturer would be better spent kept within the hospital.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Dan. We had a great presentation today, lots of good attendee participation. We're going to go ahead and close up with our remarks. Thank you once again for a great webinar. One lucky attendee today will win an Amazon gift card for completing the post-webinar survey, which will appear on your screen shortly. If you do not see the survey, please email us at webinar@mdpublishing.com. You must complete the survey to obtain your continuing education certificate. Thanks, everyone, and we'll see you the next time.
Thank you.